Hello and welcome to Chapter 15 of the OpenStax Psychology textbook. My name is Matthew Poole and I'm an instructor of psychology at Northeast State Community College. And today we'll be going over Chapter 15, Psychological Disorders. Before we get to the psychological disorders and whenever we talk about their causes, their treatments, as well as their symptoms, we have to define a few pieces of terminology. So firstly, psychopathology. Now, psychopathology may seem like an intimidating word on the front end, but whenever you break it down, it's a lot easier to understand. So when you take the root psycho, of course, with psychology, you're referring to anything of the mind or behavior. Pathology, the study of disorders, so put them together. This is the study of psychological disorders, as mentioned, their symptoms, their causes, as well as their treatments. Now, when it comes to a psychological disorder, this is a condition characterized by abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So these behaviors, thoughts, and inner experiences that are atypical, dysfunctional, or dangerous are signs of psychological disorders. However, there is no single definition of psychological abnormality or normality. And this is an important distinction to make here. Just because something is atypical does not mean that it is a disorder. So red hair is considered to be a minority hair color, but just because it's atypical does not mean that it is abnormal. That's an important distinction to make. Now, when it comes to the definition of a psychological disorder, the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, defines a psychological disorder and it consists of the following. Firstly, there are significant disturbances in thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Next, the disturbances reflect some kind of biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction. And thirdly, the disturbances lead to significant distress or disability in one's life, aka they have difficulty performing appropriate and expected roles. So again, to put this into a little bit of simpler context, whenever an individual is experiencing a psychological disorder, there has to be disturbances, of course, to their feelings, behavior, and the distress that they're experiencing is causing harm to their ability to operate socially, occupationally, and in other areas of functioning. Okay, next, when it comes to the DSM, and we'll talk about the DSM in chapter 16 as well, but we're now up to the 5th edition of this text. So DSM stands for, as mentioned, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it was first published in 1952. So it's gone through a number of revisions. We're up to the 5th now, and it is used more specifically here in the United States. You'll see it commonly in doctoral programs, master programs, because the DSM is very descriptive. But that doesn't mean, of course, it can't be used in a clinical setting as well. Most students, though, whenever they go through a psychology or maybe even mental health specifically related to counseling program, they're going to spend a good bit of time looking into the DSM, hyper-focusing on specifically learning about the causes, treatments, as well as symptoms of mental disorders. Now, whenever you're going through the DSM, you'll notice that you find these common factors. In the last bullet point from the bottom, the categories, and it categorizes and describes each disorder. So it includes diagnostic features, aka an overview of the disorder, diagnostic criteria, so what are the symptoms required and how many symptoms need to be met for there to be a diagnosis, the prevalence of the disorder, so the percentage of the population that may be afflicted, as well as risk factors. Now, something that I'm going to commonly refer to in this chapter, as well as probably in chapter 16 as well, is the word comorbidity. If you're in my class learning about this particular area of the unit, make sure to highlight or to star comorbidity. This means that there's a co-occurrence of 2 or more disorders. Okay, so whenever an individual has let's say OCD, there's this much percentage chance that they may suffer from an anxiety-related or depressive-related disorder. Now, up at the very top, a diagnosis, this is important to define as well, is the appropriate identifying and labeling of a set of defined symptoms. Okay, so it requires classification systems that organize psychological disorders systematically. Okay, and as I just mentioned, comorbidity, again, the co-occurrence of two or more disorders. Commonly what is seen is that individuals who have obsessive compulsive disorder, there's a 41% chance that they also share in experiencing major depressive disorder. Okay, so there's a little bit of overlap with those two. Now, when it comes to the International Classification of Diseases, this is published by the World Health Organization, and the criteria and the classification for disorders are similar, but there are some differences that exist. So, firstly, the ICD includes diagnoses or disorders outside of just mental health, right? So the DSM is strictly focused on mental disorders, whereas the ICD is a little bit more, not just a little bit, a lot more in depth. And the ICD isn't really as descriptive, though, comparatively to the DSM. That's why I think that, of course, we like it here to have our own stuff here in the United States, but more specifically, whenever we use these textbooks in a classroom setting, it's very nice to have it in the sense that it describes these disorders really, really well. There's no question about or any discrepancies whenever you're reading through it. It just gives it right there to you, and that's why I like that DSM-5. Okay? So, as mentioned in previous chapters, when it comes to what the historical perspective surrounding mental health was, the predominant theory was that it was due to supernatural causes. Now, some of these perspectives include demonic possession, black magic or sorcery, witchcraft, things like that. So we would have a lot of things that would take place, a lot of very unethical and horrendous actions were taking place as a result. Whenever individuals were experiencing these difficulties, they were tortured, they were beat to death. There would be exorcisms. Commonly, and there's a lot of movies that dramatize exorcisms and things like that. But this was used commonly back in the day. And one of the things, as you can see, is over in the figure 15.6 is the extraction of the Stone of Madness. So a 15th century painting by an individual who was a practitioner, or he's depicting a practitioner using a tool to extract an object, the supposed Stone of Madness, from the head of an afflicted person. Okay, obviously this was complete pseudoscience, but it didn't stop people from trying to do everything to let any sort of demon out or bad spirit, whatever the case is, because we really thought that the reason why people had mental difficulties was due to a force beyond scientific understanding. And in earlier chapters, as well as chapter 16, we talk about how there was a process known as trephination, where we would effectively try and carve a hole in your frontal lobe to let the demons out. Obviously, this led to a lot of people dying, and I guess in a way it was effective, but not really, because, well, if you're not alive to experience the mental difficulty's gone. But unsuccessful, to say the least, and actually adequately supporting individuals during that time who had difficulties. Next, there's a strange phenomenon that happened in Western Europe between the 11th and 17th centuries. And what would happen during this time, groups of people would suddenly begin to dance with wild abandon. Odd, right? Some would dance for days or weeks, screaming of terrible visions, and although the cause is unknown, the behavior was attributed to many supernatural forces. So it was really an odd thing going on during that time. And again, whenever I discuss a lot of these mental health related topics, I understand that we're all different and we have our own opinions regarding, what the cause of how we behave is. But for me, coming from the clinical side of the house, whenever people describe things that they may be experiencing hallucinations or delusions, my first thought isn't to say, well, maybe they're actually seeing like a particular spirit or a demon or whatever the case is. My initial thought is that maybe they're experiencing psychosis, which is a qualifier for schizophrenia. Now, obviously, more information is needed to be gathered before any sort of jumping to conclusions take place, but other people may take that by heart and actually truly believe that, no, supernatural causes definitely are at least a potential factor in why we behave the way we do. So that although that group has steadily declined over time, they're still mighty in their opinions and their voice. So I'll let you be the ultimate determining factor, but for the purpose of this class, that is the perspective that I take. All right, the first category of disorders that we are going to talk about includes anxiety disorders. Firstly, we'll talk about specific phobia. We'll learn how phobias develop. We're going to discuss social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, as well as generalized anxiety disorder. Now, it's important to make the distinction, too, before we get into anxiety-related disorders. Fear versus anxiety. Fear is an instantaneous reaction to an imminent threat. This is whenever your nervous system is responding to a perceived threat that it may cause harm to your health or well-being. Now, anxiety, on the other end, is apprehension, avoidance, and cautiousness regarding a potential threat, danger, or other negative content. And anxiety inherently is not a bad thing because it's effectively motivation for us to take action and to avoid certain things. There's a protector in us that is there for a reason to help us in certain moments. But sometimes anxiety can be so overwhelming and so distressing that, again, going back to earlier definition, it causes so much distress to where it affects your ability to operate socially, occupationally, and in other areas of functioning. So if you're unable to go through day-to-day experiences or actions, then that may be a potential cause for concern. Whenever the anxiety is so overwhelming that it's incongruent with the actual reality of the threat, we may take a step back and see and look a little bit further into this. What's going on here? Okay. So anxiety disorders, as I mentioned, characterized by excessive and persistent fear and anxiety and by related disturbances in behavior. Now, the prevalence of anxiety disorders affects about 1 in 4 individuals in the United States during their lifetime and is more common in women than in men. It's actually, too, the most frequently occurring class of mental disorders. All right, first disorder we will be kicking off with is specific phobia. This involves excessive distressing and persistent fear or anxiety about a specific object or situation. Okay, and people, they may realize that their fear and anxiety is irrational, but they'll still go to great lengths to avoid the stimulus. And whenever it comes to anxiety as a whole, the reason that anxiety continues to grow over time is because we engage in safety behaviors or avoiding behaviors. The one way that we can get through an anxious situation is by exposing ourselves to it incrementally and in small doses, systematic desensitization, which we'll talk about in chapter 16. And so it's a negative reinforcing process as we talked in chapter 6, where you have the anxiety-provoking event or situation or person or thing, and when you avoid it, yes, it is productive in the short term, but long term it is not. Just because something is effective in the short term does not mean that it is productive in the long term. That's important to know. Now, some specific phobias include acrophobia, which is heights, aerophobia, flying, arachnophobia, spiders, and claustrophobia, the fear of Santa Claus. The fear of enclosed spaces. All right, that was my bad dad joke for the day. No more after that. All right. Now, agoraphobia is listed as a separate anxiety disorder. It is characterized by intense fear, anxiety, and avoidance of situations in which it might be difficult to escape or receive help if one experiences a panic attack. And these situations include public transportation, crowds, being outside the home alone. Okay, so how do phobias occur? Well, there are a few ways in which they can develop. First is classical conditioning. The event actually happens to you. You have an adverse experience with a particular stimulus. So let's say you're bitten by a dog at an early age. You associate that dog with getting bitten or the pain associated with getting bitten. So based on the law of effect, we're more likely to engage in behaviors that yield a pleasant consequence and less likely to engage in behavior that yields a neutral or an unpleasant consequence. I know that's more so operant conditioning, but it remains true still and related to this right here. You're associating a stimulus with something that's unpleasant. So therefore, down the road, you're more likely to experience anxiety or fear that's incongruent with the reality of the situation. So you may have as I just mentioned, you may have just an incongruent fear or anxiety through the process of classical conditioning. So the event actually happens to you. Next, number 2 is vicarious learning. We don't always develop a fear by we experiencing it for ourselves. We can see other people stick their hand in a fire or on a stove and understand that, hey, we shouldn't do that ourselves. We don't have to learn directly whenever we see somebody get burnt, that we don't stick our hand or any of our extremities near something that's extremely hot for a long period of time, because it can result in pain or burning. Okay, so vicarious learning. A child observes their cousin react with fear around spiders. So that child later expresses the same fears even though spiders have never presented any danger to them. So no, they didn't experience getting bitten by a spider or a fearful event with a spider, but they see somebody being fearful, so maybe I should be fearful as well. Next is verbal transmission of information. Now, again, it doesn't happen directly to us. We don't see somebody else being fearful. But when we hear about somebody having an unpleasant or a scary experience, we may develop that fear as well. So, for example, a child is continuously told that snakes are dangerous. Therefore, the child starts to fear snakes. So, under classical conditioning, did they experience getting bitten or having a bad experience with a snake? No. With vicarious learning, did they see somebody being fearful of snakes and then they later developed that anxiety? No. They simply heard somebody talk about it. Now, I know of somebody who developed the fear of movie theaters as a result. Back in the day, there were mass shootings at movie premieres. And did they experience the event directly? No. Did they see the event take place? No. But they did hear about it through news channels and other outlets that were describing the events. So therefore, they developed a phobia of movie theaters. So there's a number of ways in which we can develop phobias. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Next, let's talk about social anxiety disorder. When it comes to social anxiety, this is characterized by extreme and persistent fear or anxiety and avoidance of social situations, because as we mentioned, avoidance is a surefire way to increase the anxiety in the long term. And this is where also a person could be potentially evaluated negatively by others, leading to serious impairments in life. As mentioned, we discussed safety behaviors. To give a definition to this, these are mental or behavioral acts that reduce anxiety in social situations by reducing the chance of negative social outcomes. So some safety behaviors we may engage in include avoiding eye contact or rehearsing sentences before speaking. It affects about 12% of Americans during their lifetime, and there's a high rate of comorbidity with alcohol use disorder. Now, this is important to note too here is the reason why alcohol is commonly used in social settings is because it can be used as a social lubricant. And yes, it again is effective in the short term at reducing anxiety and allowing people to talk to others that they may not be able to otherwise. But this is not a productive outlet to use long term because, again, using alcohol is kind of like a safety behavior where it temporarily reduces the anxiety, but then an individual may find themselves in a place where they can't socialize without using alcohol. And that is not something that is a productive behavior. As well as alcohol use disorder, we don't call people who abuse substances as alcoholics in a clinical setting. We say that they have a substance use disorder, and there's a specification on which drug of choice they are using. So in this case, alcohol use disorder. Now, whenever it comes to risk factors, fears of social situations possibly develop through conditioning. And this is important to know. 92% of a sample of adults with social anxiety disorder reported a history of severe teasing in childhood. Again, going back to early childhood experiences and how that affects us in adulthood, as well as classically conditioned associations where we have an unpleasant experience within a social setting or multiple unpleasant experiences through bullying or teasing, and then that can later develop into social anxiety disorder. Next, panic disorder. These are recurrent and unexpected panic attacks, along with at least 1 month of persistent concern about additional panic attacks, because we know when it comes to panic disorder and panic attacks in general, the fear of just having another panic attack can cause one to onset or to occur. As well, worrying over the consequences of the attacks or self-defeating changes in behavior related to the attacks. So if you don't know what a panic attack is, let's define it. It's a period of extreme fear or discomfort that develops abruptly and reaches a peak within 10 minutes. So what an individual may experience is a shortness of breath, chest pain, palpitations, accelerated heart rate especially, nausea or abdominal distress, as well as feeling dizzy, unsteady, and lightheaded. A very unpleasant experience. And some people, if they've not experienced a panic attack before, they may think that they're having a heart attack or that they're dying. Those are common phrases that are stated whenever an individual has a panic attack. But they don't last a significantly long amount of time, relatively speaking, but whenever you're experiencing it, it seems like it's a lot longer. I can assure you of that. Okay. Now, when it comes to panic disorder, there are some genetic components or theories behind why we experience them. So there's apparently a 43% heritability rate. So if your biological parents have panic disorder, you may experience panic disorder in your lifetime, and that's a pretty significant percentage there. And there are a number of areas of your body that may be involved in panic disorder, and they're listed throughout this slide, so I'm not going to read them off to you, but I'll let you kind of pause and take a look for yourself throughout all this. I do want to kind of keep things moving and try and keep your attention throughout this because I know this is a lot of information in one setting. So let's keep it moving and talk about generalized anxiety disorder. This is probably the last one we'll talk about in this section, and then we will move forward. So generalized anxiety disorder is defined as a relatively continuous state of excessive, uncontrollable, and pointless worry and apprehension. So the anxiety is not specified on one particular area. It's, again, just a generalized state where the anxiety is so distressing that it causes harm in your ability to operate occupationally, socially, other areas of functioning. And it can have a number of other symptoms that include restlessness, difficulty concentrating, being easily fatigued, muscle tension, irritability, and sleep difficulties. Now, to be diagnosed with GAD, the symptoms have to, as mentioned, have to occur more days than not for at least 6 months. Okay, so you can't just experience these symptoms for a few weeks or a month. This needs to be a persistent difficulty. And as mentioned, to round this off, it's diffused worrying. It's not specified on one particular object, stimulus, or situation. And the apprehension is not part of another disorder. Okay. Now, when it comes to the prevalence, it affects about 5.7% of the U.S. population during their lifetime, and females are twice as likely as males to experience the disorder. And there's a high comorbidity rate with mood disorders and other anxiety disorders. Okay. Now, when it comes to the cognitive theories of GAD, the worry represents a mental strategy to avoid more powerful negative emotions, perhaps stemming from earlier unpleasant or traumatic experiences. Again, a perspective where environmental causes in childhood can lead to the onset of particular anxiety-provoking disorders. So that first bullet point there, worrying acts as a distraction from remembering painful childhood experiences. As we'll talk about in the next two chapters, your brain is really good at protecting you through biases, through defense mechanisms, but especially when it comes to painful memories. Your brain can take a couple ways where it fragments that memory or represses it altogether, or it can show through in persistent or intrusive memories. So maybe as a side effect of this, your brain may worry so it can distract you from experiences from childhood. Okay, but still, it's an unpleasant, no matter if it's you're experiencing the memories or the worrying or anxiety, still a very unpleasant state to be in. Okay. Now, longitudinal studies found that childhood maltreatment was strongly related to the development of the disorder during adulthood. So more of kind of what I just described. Now let's move to the obsessive compulsive and related disorder section. This is where we will talk about OCD, obviously, body dysmorphic disorder, hoarding disorder, as well as some causes of OCD. Now, when it comes to OCD, let's define this. It involves thoughts and urges that are intrusive and unwanted. So we have obsessions and or the need to engage in repetitive behaviors or mental acts, compulsions. And so this is how OCD works as like a negative reinforcing property, because you have the unpleasant stimulus taking place, the antecedent, which is the obsessions, the thoughts and urges that are intrusive and unwanted. What's the behavior? Well, compulsions, repetitive behaviors, or mental acts. So let's say, for example, somebody has their obsessions involved germs. So they experience the unpleasant experience or urges and thoughts of, I've got germs on me. Behavior is repetitive hand washing for either a specified amount of time or the number of times that a person will wash their hands. So that's the behavior. What is the consequence in this ABC model? The consequence is the removal, at least temporarily, of these thoughts and urges. But again, it's just reinforcing that over time, the obsessions over time through compulsions. Another example of just because something's effective in the short term does not make it productive in the long term, and can actually cause further strengthening of the anxiety or the urges or the obsessions. Easier said than done, though. OCD is not as simple as just describing that to an individual. There are a lot of there's a lot of ways in which we can at least treat OCD through psychotherapy or talk therapy, as well as the psychotropic end, where medications are involved in trying to alleviate OCD symptoms. Okay, so moving forward, I've kind of already mentioned an example of OCD and how it will continue to develop, continue to strengthen over time, but you can name just a number of examples. For somebody, they need to lock their door a particular amount of times, or they may need to keep things in a particular order that if they don't do so, it causes significant and unpleasant, you know, um, feelings within them. And so that can only be alleviated by engaging in the compulsion. Okay. Now that's kind of glossing over it a little bit, making it a little bit more simplified, but that at least gives you an introduction into maybe further how OCD, in a lot of cases, it's not, as simplified as keeping things in order. Obviously, it's more significant than that, and it's more distressing than that, and causing people difficulty in just being able to operate in general. OCD can manifest into some very severe ways, but I'll let you do that research on your own time. But at least that's a way to introduce and make a little bit more sense on the front end, so you can see down the road how it can develop further and be more serious than just the simplified examples that I gave. Okay, next is body dysmorphic disorder. Some individuals have already heard of this before if you're taking this as a class. This is whenever an individual has a preoccupation with a perceived flaw. So they have a specific area of the body that they hyperfocus on and deem as not beautiful or ugly, is what I'm trying to say. They just think that it's a horrendous aspect of their physical appearance. But in all actuality, the perceived flaw is non-existent or barely noticeable to other people. So this will obviously cause people to think that they're unattractive or deformed. It involves usually the skin, face, or hair, but can focus again on any bodily area. And individuals may engage in repetitive and ritualistic behavioral and mental acts, which include constantly looking in the mirror, trying to hide the offending body part, comparison with others, as well as cosmetic surgery. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who gets cosmetic surgery has body dysmorphic disorder, but I would be curious to see the percentage of individuals who do go through with it if they qualify for body dysmorphic disorder. It affects about 2.4% of adults in the United States, and the rates are slightly higher in women than in men. I almost wonder if it may be due to the unrealistic expectations that society puts on women's looks. Makes you think. Next is hoarding disorder. So hoarding disorder involves great difficulty in discarding possession, regardless of how valueless or useless they actually are. And so this will usually result in an accumulation of items that clutter living or work areas. What this means is individuals keep stuff no matter, and they think that the reason that their rationale behind it is because they think that there's some inherent value to it, or that it may be useful to you down the road. I can assure you those empty McDonald's cups that are accumulating in the corner are not going to be useful to you down the road, but you can't just say it that simply and people just believe it, right? There's a whole distressing mental difficulty that they're experiencing that won't allow them to rationalize it in that way. They still think that it's going to be useful to them later, or that there's some sentimental value to it. All right. We've all seen the show Hoarders probably at least once, and so you see how severe these situations become. I mean, it will literally make one's home totally inhabitable. So what are some of the causes of OCD? Well, there's neuroscientific perspectives that go into it and describe which areas of the brain may be impacted and why, as an explanation, you experience OCD symptoms. Now, when it comes to the prefrontal cortex, as we've mentioned, prefrontal cortex is kind of like that filtration system where it is involved in decision-making, problem-solving, and judgment, allowing you to be kind of the mature area of the brain, right? But whenever there's an imbalance, or there's a difficulty, I should say, with the prefrontal cortex, this is associated with body dysmorphic disorder, okay? Now, the anterior cingulate cortex, right behind the prefrontal cortex, is associated with hoarding disorder, and the orbitofrontal cortex, kind of like right underneath there where the prefrontal cortex is associated with OCD. So it seems like whenever there's difficulty with those particular areas of the brain, individuals may be at a higher likelihood of developing one of those OCD-related disorders. Next, post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's define PTSD, the risk factors, support for sufferers, and learning and development of PTSD. So the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder includes an individual who was exposed to, witnessed, or experienced the details of a traumatic experience that literally could have caused the actual consequences to their health or well-being. And this can be due to, experiencing within one's time in the military, traumatic events that are physical threats to their health or well-being. This can be sexual, violence, things like that, serious injury, severe car accidents. A number of items can qualify for trauma. Now, these symptoms have to occur for at least 1 month of the following: intrusive and distressing memories of the event, where one will probably experience flashbacks of the particular event or events that took place; avoidance of stimuli connected to the event, so as to avoid triggering either flashbacks or distressing memories; persistently negative emotional states, feelings of detachment from others, irritability, proneness toward outbursts, as well as an exaggerated startle response. And this is actually a pretty high number here. PTSD affects about 7% of individuals in the United States during their lifetime. Okay, so let's look at some more risk factors for PTSD. Of course, trauma. Those involving harm by others carrying greater risks than those do not. Lack of immediate social support. So social support includes comfort, advice, and assistance from relatives, friends, neighbors, and this can reduce the risk of developing PTSD. Subsequent life stress. Females are at a higher likelihood of developing PTSD. Low SES, lower intelligence has actually been associated with it. Personal history of mental disorders, history of childhood adversity, family history of mental disorders, as well as personality characteristics. Neuroticism, individuals who score high in neuroticism are more prone to negative emotions. That doesn't mean that they're crazy, they're not neurotic, okay? That's often associated with neuroticism, but just again, associated with more so just proneness toward negative emotions. Sorry, my brain kind of short circuited there for a second, but I'm not going to clip this. I'm going to keep it in just to show you that I'm not perfect. And lastly, possession of one or two short versions of a gene that regulates serotonin. So let's keep it moving. I try to make these videos as candid as possible, as if I am teaching them, and not as robotic, to hopefully keep you engaged. But I understand that may be the case in certain moments, and where this is a longer lecture, longer video, I may have to exercise that to keep you engaged. But this is an interesting chapter in general, so I think that this will serve a lot of people as they go through it and learn a little bit more, at least at an introductory level, of the different categories found within the DSM-5. Revolving around mental difficulties. So now let's talk about mood disorders. Major depressive disorder, subtypes of depression, bipolar disorder, the biological basis of mood disorders, cognitive theories of depression. Okay, so when it comes to mood disorders, we've got a couple categories here. Depressive disorders, this includes depression, intense and persistent sadness, which we'll define a little bit more down into the next few slides. That's the main feature. And then we've got bipolar and related disorder. So we're going to kind of distinguish between, in other categories, borderline personality disorder versus bipolar, because I think when a lot of people think of bipolar, they're actually referring to borderline personality disorder. So I'll make that distinction when we get there. All right. So major depressive disorder. This is a very common disorder diagnosed here in the United States. Now, the diagnostic criteria for MDD includes a depressed mood for most of the day, nearly every day, as well as a loss of interest and pleasure in usual activities. And at least 5 of the following symptoms below need to be experienced for at least a 2-week period. And these symptoms cause, again, as always, significant distress or impairment in one's normal functioning, their ability to operate socially, occupationally, and other areas of functioning, and are not caused by substances or a medical condition. Okay? So these symptoms include weight loss or weight gain, increased or decreased appetite, of course, follows that. Difficulty falling asleep or sleeping too much, psychomotor agitation, fatigue, loss of energy, feeling of worthlessness or guilt, difficulty concentrating, indecisiveness, as well as, unfortunately, suicidal ideation, thoughts of death, thinking about or planning one's death, as well as an attempt. Now, when it comes to MDD and its prevalence, it affects about 6.6% of the population each year. Again, that's each year, and almost 17% of the U.S. population in their lifetime. So that's a really significant number, and it's more common among women than in men. Now, some risk factors associated with MDD include unemployment, low income, living in urban areas, as well as being separated, divorced, or widowed. Now let's look at some subtypes of depression. Seasonal pattern. Okay, this is otherwise known as seasonal affective disorder, and I find the acronym a little bit comical. If you can make any of this comical, because I don't want to shed it in any sort of lighthearted, because this is a very serious topic, but whenever there's moments in here that you can try and make it lighthearted, I'm going to try to. But seasonal affective disorder is the acronym SAD. So this applies to situations in which a person experiences the symptoms of major depressive disorder, but only during a particular time of the year. For most people, they will experience seasonal affective disorder during the winter months. Again, it gets colder, and it's not as bright out for as long as it is during the summer. So lack of sunshine. Some people go into work and it's dark, and then they'll leave work and it's dark because the sun sets at like 6 o'clock here in the Eastern time code, Eastern time. So next is peripartum onset or postpartum depression. This is whenever individuals will experience major depression during pregnancy or in the first 4 weeks following the birth, more specifically, as well as dysthymia or persistent depressive disorder. So this is whenever individuals have a depressed mood for most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 years, as well as at least 2 of the other symptoms of major depression. So the key marked difference between dysthymia and major depressive disorder is that these individuals are chronically sad, but they do not meet all of the criteria for major depression. Okay, so it's 2 symptoms versus all the number of others for major depressive. Okay, let's talk about bipolar disorder. This involves mood states that fluctuate between depression and mania. So it's a slower process. These periods of mania and depression last for at least a week. And when people they think of bipolar like this constant flip-flopping of a mood, but that's more so associated with borderline personality as far as the symptoms that we'll talk about down the road. But whenever an individual experiences a period of mania, this includes excessively talkative, excessively irritable, will exhibit a flight of ideas, so they'll talk loudly and rapidly, abruptly switching from one topic to another. So they're saying a lot of things, but it doesn't really add up to anything truly intelligible. They're easily distracted. They exhibit grandiosity, especially, and inflated but unjustified self-esteem and self-confidence. Show little need for sleep, take on several tasks at once, and engage in reckless behaviors. And usually the onset is before the age of 25 and affects 1 out of 100 people in the United States in their lifetime. Okay, so when it comes to the biological basis of mood disorders, when it comes to MDD, relatives have double the risk of developing the disorder, and I find interesting twin studies associated with mental disorder. So individuals who are identical twins, if one has MDD, there's a 50% concordance rate. With fraternal twins, it's a 38% concordance rate. When it comes to bipolar disorder, relatives have over a 9 times risk of developing bipolar. That is a significant number. But the concordance rate is significantly different between identical versus fraternal twins in bipolar disorder. For identical, there's a 67% concordance rate, and for fraternal twins, there's a 16% concordance rate. When it comes to the biological basis of mood disorders, now, they're not in every single case for depression is it a result of an imbalance in neurotransmitters. Are there cases that is what's happening? I would say so. And so whenever individuals have depression, what they're commonly prescribed is an antidepressant, usually an SSRI, or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it inhibits the reuptake or reabsorption of serotonin, so there's more available in this synaptic cleft here. So it can continue binding to its receptors to, continue firing an action potential. All right. Now, when it comes to bipolar, lithium is commonly prescribed, which blocks norepinephrine activity. So it works as an antagonist. Okay, it blocks in that regard. So it blocks norepinephrine activity at the synapse from binding to its applicable receptors. All right. Moving forward, when it comes to depression, a couple areas of the brain that may be involved includes the amygdala, which is important in, as we've learned throughout the whole course, emotion processing as well as the fear response more specifically. And so depressed individuals actually react to negative emotional stimuli such as sad faces with greater amygdala activation than do non-depressed individuals, as well as they're more prone to react emotionally to negative stimuli. When it comes to the prefrontal cortex, it's involved in regulating and controlling those emotions. So as we learned about in earlier chapters, chapter 3 with biopsychology with Phineas Gage, he had his limbic system separated from his especially the prefrontal cortex, and within that limbic system is the amygdala. So if the amygdala is involved in emotions and you don't have that prefrontal cortex allowing for filtration to occur, then emotions can fire off rapidly and without regulation. Okay. So, but when it comes to mood disorder specifically and the prefrontal cortex, there's decreased activation in depressed individuals, which may inhibit its ability to override negative emotions. So there's greater difficulty controlling emotional reactions. Okay, and we do, because we're talking about depression, we do have to mention suicide. I hope that YouTube doesn't flag this and take it down, because this is for educational purposes. So maybe they'll continue to let it take place and stay up. But we have to talk about it because awareness is key. And unfortunately, 90% of those who complete suicide have a diagnosis of at least one mental disorder, most frequently mood disorders, of course. Now, in 2010, this has been some time, actually it's been a lot of time, no matter when you're watching this, whether it's this is published in 2023, if you're watching this still in 2033, I'd say this number continues to go up, especially past the pandemic in 2020, things like that. But as of 2010, this data could be updated. It's the 10th leading cause of death for all ages. And during that time, that's an average of 105 each day. Now, it's 4 times higher among males than females, and the reason this is the case is because males most commonly use means in which completion has a higher rate of going through, such as firearms, where females commonly use poison. Okay. Now, some risk factors include substance abuse problems. This is individuals at a 10 times greater risk. Previous attempts, access to lethal means, withdrawal from social relationships, feeling like a burden, engaging in reckless and risk-taking behaviors, a sense of entrapment, cyberbullying, suicide of a family member, as well as serotonin dysfunction. Okay, let's move toward schizophrenia. Now, when it comes to schizophrenia and the symptoms, we're going to get to that in a minute. So I want to first talk about some causes of schizophrenia. So it affects about 1% of the population, and an individual is times greater risk if one parent has schizophrenia. There's a big genetic component when it comes to schizophrenia. As well, what is potentially some of the reasons why we develop it? Like, what's the biopsych perspective? What's going on with neurotransmitter activity? Well, there is a dopamine hypothesis. And whenever individuals experience the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, when I say positive, I don't inherently mean good. I just mean that something's being added to the situation. Individuals will experience the symptoms of psychosis, like hallucinations and delusions. These are things that are added to the person's life. Whereas low levels of dopamine are associated with negative symptoms, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Now, drugs that increase dopamine levels can produce schizophrenia-like symptoms, so that's something to be mindful of. And medications that block dopamine activity can reduce the symptoms. Okay, so moving forward, let's look at some of these symptoms of schizophrenia. Hallucinations are visual as well as auditory experiences that are not congruent with reality, but people truly believe that what they see is actually there. So this can be, again, seeing things that are not congruent with reality, as well as hearing voices that are not congruent, or noises that are not being experienced by the rest of the world. It is strictly by the individual, as well as delusions. These are beliefs about the world that are not congruent with reality, and these can include a number of different categories of delusions. So individuals may experience paranoid delusions, where they think that the FBI may be after them, or that they've got grandiose delusions, which is when somebody may believe that they have special access to a higher power, and they may proclaim that they have the vision of the future, or what this higher power has stated is going to happen to the world. So it's their job to share that message, and that they are the chosen one to be able to send this information out. Next is somatic delusions, where one may think that they have like a disease that nobody has experienced before, or that they have bugs in their skin, something that's highly abnormal that's happening to their body, as well as one individual may have thought withdrawal and insertion. Now, an individual will commonly experience within schizophrenia disorganized thinking, so disjointed and incoherent thought processing, disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, as well as catatonic behaviors, which is decreased reactivity to one's environment. Now, these negative symptoms include things that are taken away from a person's behavior or abilities. Includes avolition, the lack of motivation to engage in self-initiating and meaningful activity; alosia, reduced speech output; asociality, aka social withdrawal; and anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure. And what you'll see too with schizophrenia is with the disorganized thinking may come word salad, where an individual will say a lot of words, but they don't add up to coherent sentences. Now let's talk about some dissociative disorders. Dissociative amnesia, depersonalization/derealization disorder, dissociative identity disorder. Now, when it comes to dissociative amnesia, this is when an individual has an inability to recall important personal information. So what may follow, it's usually after a stressful or traumatic experience, is dissociative fugue, which is when an individual will suddenly wander off from home. They'll have confusions about their identity, and in some cases may adopt a new identity. And if you've ever watched Breaking Bad, Walter fakes a dissociative fugue state where he's just trying to hide the fact of the activities that he was engaging in. So he acted like he wandered off from home and had confusions about his identity, and then finally came to at a gas station. Next is depersonalization/derealization disorder. So it's characterized by recurring episodes of either depersonalization, derealization, or an individual may experience both, but only one of the two is needed to be experienced to qualify for this disorder. So depersonalization, I'm going to try to make this as simple as I can. Depersonalization is detachment from oneself. So I think, and of all people who explained this, Post Malone described depersonalization like watching your life through a movie. It's like you see what's taking place, but you feel detached from yourself, or an unfamiliarity with yourself. Whereas derealization is this sense of detachment from reality, or the world is what I should say, be it individuals, inanimate objects, or all surrounding. Okay, so detaching from the world, not just detaching from oneself. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. This was whenever an individual exhibits two or more separate personalities or identities. I think it's often dramatized in movies where somebody may have like 18 different personalities, and I'm not saying that's not possible, but commonly the numbers are low in the different amount of personalities. But something that is common that the movies do get somewhat correct is that there was trauma in the early childhood years, and so it may be. I won't go into it much further than that, but I'll say that's something that they do get kind of accurate. And whenever an individual switch from one personality to another, there are legitimate memory gaps in that whatever one personality takes over, that's their memory state, and then there's a gap between maybe what you identify as yourself and who you truly are. You don't really recognize what that other personality did whenever they took the forefront. So it's definitely an interesting disorder, a very distressing and unfortunate disorder for people who experience it. And I'm sure there's a lot of cases online where you can see interviews with people who have dissociative identity disorder to learn a little bit more. All right, now let's go to personality disorders, borderline as well as antisocial. As mentioned, borderline personality disorder is what people are usually referring to when they think of bipolar, where it's this quicker shift in mood states. And so that's one of the key marked symptoms of BPD. It's being moody, sarcastic, bitter, and verbally abusive. May sometimes show intense and inappropriate anger, may be highly impulsive, and may engage in reckless and destructive behaviors. An unstable view of self may suddenly, like I said, display a shift in personal attitudes, interests, career plans, and often choice of friends. Relationships are intense and unstable and cannot tolerate the fear of being alone, fear of abandonment. Okay, and so one may engage in frantic efforts to avoid abandonment or separation. Affects about 1.4% of the U.S. population, and causes may include core personality traits such as impulsivity and emotional instability, show a high degree of heritability, and many individuals report childhood abuse. So this is a common theme, as you all can gather up until this point, where how impactful early childhood experiences can truly be. But overall, BPD is characterized by an instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, and mood, as well as marked impulsivity. Then we've got antisocial personality disorder. This disorder is pretty interesting, and it's characterized by complete lack of regard for other people's rights or feelings. Now, people who have antisocial personality disorder, I do think that there's a definite stigma here where they think that all criminals just have ASPD. And that's not inherently the case. So we just kind of hear about certain individuals who have done some pretty heinous things, and we associate ASPD strictly with them. So that's where we get our interpretation of this disorder. But let's look more specifically at some of the symptoms. Repeatedly performing illegal acts, lying to or conning others, impulsivity and recklessness, irritability and aggressiveness, failure to act in responsible ways, lack of remorse, especially, overinflated sense of self, superficial charm. So initially, they may come off as charming, but it's ultimately to see how they can maybe potentially take advantage and basically gain your trust, so they can eventually see what they can get out of you. A lack of ability to empathize, that is especially true. Have very significant difficulty in taking the perspective of others and putting themselves in the shoes of others. Now, for an individual to officially receive a diagnosis, they have to be at least 18 years of age, and it's more common than you think. It's about 3.6% of the population. So for about every 100 people you meet, 3 to 4 of them may qualify for ASPD, and it's more common in males. All right. So some causes of ASPD may include some genetic factors, and as well as some brain anatomy, especially. Now, I'll probably start here with the brain anatomy. So research has revealed a couple things. And this is important to know here, as well as it's just interesting in general. There's less activation in brain regions involved in the experience of empathy and feeling concern for others, as well as there's greater activation in a brain area involved in self-awareness, cognitive function, and interpersonal experience. Interesting. Now, when it comes to the emotional deficits, individuals with ASPD fail to show fear in response to environment cues that signal punishment, pain, or noxious stimulation. So, what's interesting with this is that, like, let's say, for example, we're pulled over by a police officer. Even though, it may have just been something simple, speeding, or we had a tail light out, we may experience like a slight fear in that moment. Whereas somebody with ASPD, they don't show that same level of fear that we do. And their initial thought may not be, oh, I'm kind of scared right now. It's like, what can I potentially do to manipulate this person to get out of the situation? All right. Now, when it comes to genetics, personality and temperament dimensions related to this disorder have a genetic influence. As well as adoption studies suggest antisocial behavior is determined by the interaction of genetic factors as well as adverse environmental circumstances, so both a nature and nurture development. Okay, we're going to now talk about disorders in childhood, so we're finishing up now. Firstly, let's talk about autism spectrum disorder. The symptoms of ASD, and again, it's a spectrum, so keep that in mind. These symptoms include deficits in social interaction. So, for example, may not make eye contact, turn a head away when spoken to, prefer playing alone. Deficits in communication. So, this can include one-word responses, maybe no speech output, difficulty maintaining conversation, echoed speech, and problems using and understanding nonverbal cues, as well as repetitive patterns of behaviors or interests. Now, the prevalence of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, affects about 1 in 88 children in the U.S. and is 5 times more common in boys. Now, the genetic components related to twin studies are pretty surprising to me. When it comes to identical twins, I know this is a broad range, but 60 to 90% concordance rate. With fraternal twins, it's about 5 to 10%. Now, the genes involved are those important in formation of synaptic circuits that facilitate communication between different areas of the brain, and some environmental factors that may influence this is pollutants during either pregnancy or shortly thereafter with giving birth. And that's why prenatal care is so important, and to be mindful of what's going into the body. Now, ADHD, this is commonly, again, diagnosed in childhood. So when we say ADHD, we mean attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So this means that it involves developmental problems in personal, social, academic, and intellectual functioning. So with ADHD, there's a constant pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsive behavior that interferes with normal function, because there's a perspective there that the areas in the frontal lobe are impacted with ADHD, and because the frontal lobe is associated with decision making, problem solving, as well as judgment, that filtration system is not performing like it should. So behaviors may be a little bit more impulsive as a result. So the symptoms of inattention include difficulty sustaining attention, obviously, failure to follow instructions, disorganization, lack of attention to detail, easily distracted, and forgetful. When it comes to hyperactivity, this includes obviously excessive movement, interrupting and intruding on others, blurting out responses before questions have been completed, as well as difficulty waiting one's turn. So this occurs in about 5% of children, and boys are 3 times more likely to have ADHD than girls. There is as well a dopamine perspective or hypothesis that's involved in ADHD. So the idea behind why individuals take the certain medications that they do, aka stimulants, is so it allows for more dopamine to be available within the brain. So genes involved are thought to include at least 2 that are important in the regulation of dopamine. Individuals with ADHD show less dopamine activity in key regions of the brain, especially associated with motivation and reward. And because the medications are considered stimulants, they will elevate dopamine activity. Now, I'm not saying in all cases, obviously, people say whenever they have a cup of coffee, or for individuals who have ADHD, when they have a cup of coffee, they don't experience the same effects that individuals without ADHD do. So they may say that it calms them down, or makes them, they experience the effects associated with having a stimulant, in that it will alleviate some of their symptoms of ADHD. Now, if that's the case for you, some of us just may have a higher tolerance to caffeine, and so we don't experience the same experiences as those who have maybe a lower or moderate tolerance to caffeine. Some of us, we can have caffeine. I don't have ADHD, but I can definitely have coffee, and I guess because of my tolerance of it, or just my natural disposition, I can go to sleep even after I have coffee. But that doesn't mean that I have ADHD. So I want that to be made known. And there's a high genetic component to ADHD, in that genetically speaking, if the parents have symptoms of inattention or hyperactivity, it's a 71% rate and a 73% rate, respectively, with attention and hyperactivity. So that, I appreciate you sticking to. If you made it through this whole video, you are an absolute trooper. I appreciate you taking the time to complete this chapter of the OpenStax psychology textbook, where we went through a plethora of mental difficulties. If we were to go through them all, this would be a 40-plus hour video. So we don't have time for that, and maybe down the road we'll do videos on each individual one. But I will see you all in the next one for the very last chapter of this textbook, where we will be talking about clinical psychology in general, as well as therapy and treatments. We'll see you then. Have a great day.